how a future king could inherit billions of pounds in land, wealth, and influence, yet still feel powerless when it comes to the one place that matters most to him personally? According to supporters of a growing royal narrative, that question sits at the heart of a story that has been quietly unfolding behind palace walls, a story involving Princess Diana's legacy, Queen Camilla's family, and an inheritance battle that has very little to do with money and everything to do with memory. While headlines have focused on royal appearances, public engagements, and political events, supporters of the narrative claim that a far more emotional issue has been troubling Prince William, one connected not to the throne he will someday inherit, but to the place where his mother truly belongs. And according to the story, everything intensified when a quiet property transfer involving Camilla's family suddenly forced people to compare two very different royal legacies. According to supporters of the narrative, the chain of events began in early 2026, when Queen Camilla allegedly completed a remarkably discreet transfer of one of her most cherished private properties. There was no major announcement, no press conference, and no carefully orchestrated royal statement. Instead, the change reportedly surfaced through property records that attracted little attention at first. According to the story, Camilla transferred ownership of her beloved Wiltshire residence, Mill House, directly to her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez. Supporters of the narrative claim that the move was presented as routine estate planning, the kind of practical decision many families make when preparing for the future. On the surface, there appeared to be nothing controversial about it. Parents pass assets to their children all the time. Yet according to many royal observers, the timing of the transfer created an unexpected conversation because it highlighted a striking contrast between the inheritance available to Camilla's children and the complicated legacy surrounding Princess Diana's sons. What reportedly caught people's attention was not the house itself. It was what the transfer symbolized. Camilla was protecting her family's future, securing assets, and ensuring that something deeply personal would remain within her own family line. According to supporters of the narrative, that raised an uncomfortable question. What about Diana's legacy? According to the story, Prince William occupies one of the most powerful positions in Britain. Following King Charles's accession to the throne, William inherited control of the Duchy of Cornwall, a vast estate stretching across more than 100,000 acres and generating tens of millions of pounds in annual revenue. Supporters of the narrative emphasize that the future king now oversees wealth and resources far beyond anything Diana herself ever possessed. He controls land, businesses, agricultural operations, and one of the most important financial engines supporting the monarchy. Yet despite all that power, there is one place he allegedly cannot control, cannot inherit, and cannot claim. That place is Althorpe, Diana's childhood home, the place where she spent her formative years, the place most closely connected to her life before royalty, and the place where she was ultimately laid to rest. According to supporters of the narrative, this reality creates a deeply emotional contradiction. William may inherit the throne, he may inherit royal responsibilities, and he may inherit centuries of institutional power, yet the location most closely tied to his mother's personal story remains entirely outside his control. Supporters of the story argue that this fact became impossible to ignore once Camilla's property transfer entered public discussion because people suddenly found themselves comparing two families, two inheritances, and two very different outcomes. According to many commentators, William reportedly respects the legal realities involved. He understands the inheritance system. He understands the Spencer family's traditions. And he understands that Althorpe was never his mother's property to pass down. Yet supporters of the narrative claim that understanding something intellectually does not necessarily make it easier emotionally. Because while Diana's sons can visit, they cannot control. While they can remember, they cannot decide the future of the estate. And while they remain forever connected to Diana herself, the land most associated with her life belongs to someone else entirely. According to the story, this emotional tension had existed quietly for years. It remained largely hidden beneath the surface because there was little reason to discuss it publicly. Then Camilla's transfer reportedly changed everything. Suddenly, people noticed that her children were receiving a treasured family property directly from their mother, while questions surrounding Diana's legacy remained far more complicated. Supporters of the narrative argue that this comparison reignited conversations about inheritance, memory, and the unusual position in which William finds himself despite being one of the most powerful individuals in the country. What makes this chapter especially compelling is that William allegedly began viewing the issue differently. Not as a legal dispute, not as a fight over ownership, and not as a question of wealth, but as a question of preservation. How could Diana's legacy be protected? Who would safeguard the places and memories most closely associated with her life? And what role should William play in that effort? According to supporters of the narrative, those questions would soon push him toward decisions that could reshape the future of Diana's legacy forever. Because as attention turned toward Althorpe, the Spencer family, and the inheritance rules governing one of Britain's most famous estates, William reportedly found himself confronting a painful reality. Despite everything he had inherited, the place that mattered most to his mother would never automatically become his. And according to the story, that realization would set the stage for an emotional battle over memory, history, and the true meaning of inheritance itself. According to supporters of the narrative, the deeper William looked into questions surrounding Diana's legacy, the more he allegedly found himself confronting a reality that seemed almost impossible for outsiders to understand, because while the public saw a future king who possessed immense wealth, enormous influence, and access to resources beyond the reach of almost anyone else in Britain, William reportedly remained unable to secure the one place that carried the greatest emotional connection to his mother's life, a place that represented not Diana the princess, not Diana the global icon, but Diana the young woman who existed long before royal titles, palace ceremonies, and worldwide fame entered the picture. And according to many commentators following the story, that place was Althorpe. According to the narrative, most people assumed that William inherited everything connected to Diana after her death. The money, the jewelry, the memories, and the legacy. But supporters of the story argue that this assumption overlooks one critical fact. Diana's most important inheritance was never financial. It was geographical. It was emotional. And it was rooted in a landscape that William would never actually own. According to supporters of the narrative, Althorpe is not simply a country estate. It is one of the oldest aristocratic properties in Britain, held by the Spencer family for centuries and deeply intertwined with Diana's identity long before she became Princess of Wales. It was there that she spent much of her youth. It was there that many of her earliest memories were formed. And it was there that she returned emotionally whenever royal life became overwhelming. Supporters of the story claim that understanding Diana requires understanding Althorpe because the estate represented stability, family history, and belonging in a way the royal system never fully could. What reportedly makes the situation so emotionally complicated for William is the fact that no amount of power can change the inheritance rules governing the estate. Not royal authority, not public support, and not even the future crown itself. According to supporters of the narrative, the rules were established long before William was born, long before Diana became famous, and long before anyone imagined her sons would someday become central figures in royal history. According to the story, the Spencer family inheritance system operates independently from the monarchy and follows traditions stretching back generations. The estate does not pass through Diana's descendants simply because she once lived there. Instead, it follows a separate family line governed by long-standing inheritance customs. Supporters of the narrative emphasize that this means William and Harry can visit Althorpe, honor their mother's memory there, and maintain relationships with the Spencer family, but they will never automatically inherit ownership of the property itself. For William, that reportedly creates a strange contradiction. He controls the Duchy of Cornwall. He oversees enormous financial resources. He manages one of the most significant land portfolios in Britain. And one day, he will inherit the responsibilities of kingship itself. Yet the place most connected to his mother's personal story remains permanently outside his reach. According to many commentators, this contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore after Camilla's quiet property transfer because it highlighted how differently the two family legacies were unfolding. Camilla could reportedly ensure that a beloved personal residence passed directly to her children. The process was straightforward, the outcome was clear, and the future ownership of the property was secured. By contrast, Supporters of the narrative claim that Diana's sons occupy a far more complicated position because the most emotionally important location connected to their mother's life belongs not to them but to another branch of the family entirely. According to the story, the emotional center of this issue lies not within the main house itself, but on a small island located within the grounds of Althorpe. An island surrounded by water, an island inaccessible to ordinary visitors, and an island that serves as Diana's final resting place. Supporters of the narrative claim that Diana's brother intentionally chose the location to ensure that she would finally receive the privacy and peace that had so often been denied to her during life. The site was deliberately isolated, deliberately protected, and deliberately separated from the constant public attention that had followed her for years. According to the story, this decision transformed the island into one of the most emotionally significant places associated with Diana's memory. What makes the situation especially poignant is that William and Harry are reportedly always welcome there. They can visit, they can reflect, and they can spend time at their mother's grave whenever they choose. Yet according to supporters of the narrative, visiting is not the same as owning, remembering is not the same as protecting, and access is not the same as control. According to many royal observers, this distinction allegedly weighs heavily on William because the future king understands that history is preserved not only through memories but through stewardship. Buildings require protection, archives require management, and historically significant places require long-term planning. Supporters of the story argue that William increasingly began asking himself what would happen decades into the future when new generations inherited responsibility for Diana's legacy, and whether enough safeguards existed to ensure that the places most closely associated with her life would continue receiving the care and respect they deserved. According to the narrative, these concerns gradually transformed William's perspective. What had once seemed like a personal disappointment allegedly evolved into a broader mission focused on preservation, legacy, and historical responsibility. The issue was no longer whether he could own Althorpe. He understood that he could not. The real question became how he could ensure that Diana's memory remained protected even without ownership. And according to supporters of the story, it was that realization that would eventually push William toward a series of decisions that shocked royal insiders, frustrated members of Camilla's circle, and fundamentally changed the conversation surrounding Diana's legacy forever. According to supporters of the narrative, the emotional conflict surrounding Althorpe allegedly became even more intense once Prince William fully accepted that no legal pathway existed through which he could ever inherit the estate itself, because while many members of the public assumed that Diana's eldest son would eventually gain control over the property most closely associated with her memory, the reality was reportedly far more complicated, forcing William to confront the uncomfortable truth that despite his future as king and his extraordinary personal influence, some aspects of his mother's legacy would always remain beyond his authority. And according to many royal observers, that realization reportedly created a growing sense of frustration that palace insiders quietly noticed but rarely discussed publicly. According to the narrative, understanding the situation requires understanding the history of Althorpe itself. The estate is not simply a large country house. It is not merely a family property. And it is not just another aristocratic residence hidden within the English countryside. According to supporters of the story, Althorpe represents more than 5 centuries of Spencer family history, generations of inheritance, generations of responsibility, and a legacy that predates Diana's birth by hundreds of years. According to the story, the estate has passed through the Spencer family for centuries under inheritance traditions designed to preserve continuity from one generation to the next. Those traditions reportedly prioritize the direct Spencer line rather than descendants connected through other branches of the family. As a result, supporters of the narrative emphasize that William and Harry were never positioned to inherit Althorpe regardless of their mother's fame, public influence, or historical importance. The estate belongs to the Spencer family lineage, and according to long-established custom, it will continue following that path into the future. What allegedly made this especially difficult for William was the symbolic meaning attached to the property. Because Althorpe is not just where Diana grew up, it is where her story began, where her childhood unfolded, and where many of the memories that shaped her identity were created long before she became one of the most recognizable women in the world. According to supporters of the narrative, every room, every pathway, and every corner of the estate carries echoes of Diana's life. According to many commentators following the story, the most emotionally significant location on the estate is the small island situated within the Oval Lake, the secluded site where Diana was laid to rest after her death in 1997. Supporters of the narrative claim that the location was chosen specifically to provide peace, privacy, and protection from the relentless public attention that had followed her throughout her life. Surrounded by water and largely inaccessible to visitors, the island reportedly symbolizes the tranquility Diana struggled to find while living under constant scrutiny. For William, the island reportedly carries a significance that few people outside the family can fully understand. It is not merely a gravesite, it is the final connection, the final physical place where he can feel close to his mother. And according to supporters of the story, that emotional connection only deepened as he grew older. According to the narrative, William has visited Althorpe on numerous occasions over the years, often away from public attention and media coverage. Supporters of the story argue that these visits reportedly became increasingly important following major milestones in his life, including marriage, fatherhood, and growing royal responsibilities. At each stage, Diana's absence was felt more deeply, and Althorpe allegedly remained one of the few places where reflection felt possible away from official duties and public expectations. What reportedly troubled William was not the Spencer family's stewardship of the estate. There was no family feud, no public dispute, and no allegation of mismanagement. Instead, according to supporters of the narrative, the frustration stemmed from something far more personal. The realization that one-day decisions affecting the estate would continue being made by others, not by him. According to many royal observers, this realization allegedly became more difficult to ignore as Camilla's children quietly secured their own inheritance arrangements. While Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez reportedly benefited from clear and direct succession plans involving family assets, William's relationship with Althorpe remained dependent on circumstances beyond his control. Supporters of the narrative claim that this contrast repeatedly resurfaced in private conversations among royal insiders because it highlighted the unusual reality that immense royal power does not automatically translate into personal control over family history. According to the story, William gradually began reframing the issue in his mind. If ownership was impossible, then preservation became essential. If inheritance was unattainable, then influence could still matter. And if Althorpe would never belong to him, perhaps Diana's broader legacy could still be protected in other ways. Supporters of the narrative argue that this shift in thinking marked a turning point because it moved William away from frustration and toward action. Rather than focusing on what he could not inherit, he allegedly began concentrating on what he could preserve. Rather than dwelling on legal limitations, he reportedly started exploring ways to strengthen Diana's historical legacy beyond the boundaries of any single property. And according to the story, that decision would soon place him on a path that surprised palace insiders, unsettled members of Camilla's circle, and ultimately transformed the debate from one about inheritance into one about legacy itself. According to supporters of the narrative, the contrast between the futures of William and Camilla's children allegedly became impossible to ignore as discussions surrounding inheritance, legacy, and family property continued gaining attention behind palace walls, because while Prince William possessed extraordinary wealth, royal status, and a direct path to the throne, Camilla's children reportedly enjoyed something that he could never obtain through power alone: complete certainty regarding the future of the properties and family assets most closely associated with their mother's personal life. And according to many royal observers, that contrast allegedly created quiet tension within royal circles, not because of open conflict or public disagreement, but because it highlighted two fundamentally different approaches to preserving family history. According to the story, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez entered adulthood under very different circumstances from William and Harry. They were not senior royals. They carried no constitutional responsibilities, and they faced none of the pressures associated with preparing for future kingship. Yet supporters of the narrative claim that when it came to family inheritance, their position was in some ways remarkably straightforward. The assets connected to their mother, the home she cherished, and the places most closely tied to her personal story could be passed directly to them. According to supporters of the narrative, Camilla's transfer of Ray Mill House became symbolic for precisely this reason. The property was not merely a valuable residence. It represented continuity, it represented family control, and it represented the ability to ensure that future decisions regarding the estate would remain within the immediate family. Supporters of the story argue that the transfer demonstrated a level of certainty that William could never achieve regarding Althorp, regardless of his status as heir to the throne. What reportedly made the comparison especially striking was the sheer imbalance of power involved. William controlled the Duchy of Cornwall. He oversaw enormous resources. He commanded influence extending across the United Kingdom. And one day he would become king. Yet according to supporters of the narrative, none of those advantages alter the fact that Althorp remained outside his control. Meanwhile, Camilla's children allegedly enjoyed direct inheritance arrangements requiring no royal authority whatsoever. According to many commentators following the narrative, palace insiders allegedly became increasingly aware of the emotional implications of this contrast. Supporters of the story claim that conversations about Diana's legacy were no longer limited to questions of memory and tribute. Instead, they increasingly focused on long-term stewardship and the practical reality that William's connection to the most important location in his mother's life depended entirely upon decisions made by others. While there was reportedly no hostility between William and the Spencer family, the underlying situation remained unchanged. According to the narrative, this realization gradually influenced William's thinking. He allegedly began understanding that ownership was not the only form of control. Preservation could also create influence. Historical institutions could create influence, and public legacy could create influence. Supporters of the story argue that once William embraced this perspective, his focus shifted away from property itself and toward something much larger, protecting Diana's memory on a national scale. According to supporters of the narrative, William reportedly concluded that if he could never inherit Althorp, then the most effective response would be to strengthen Diana's broader legacy so dramatically that no single property could ever define it. Rather than concentrating on what belonged to the Spencer family, he allegedly began exploring ways to expand public access to Diana's history through archives, charitable initiatives, educational programs, and preservation efforts capable of reaching far beyond the boundaries of any estate. What makes this stage of the story especially significant is that it allegedly surprised many people around him. Some expected frustration, some expected resentment, and some expected a prolonged focus on inheritance questions. Instead, according to supporters of the narrative, William reportedly chose a different path entirely, a path centered on legacy rather than ownership. According to many observers, this shift began attracting attention inside royal circles because it reflected a broader evolution in William's leadership style. Rather than attempting to acquire what he could not legally possess, he allegedly focused on building institutions and initiatives capable of preserving Diana's influence for future generations. Supporters of the story claim that this approach impressed some advisors while frustrating others who believed inheritance disputes should simply be left alone. Yet William reportedly remained convinced that preserving memory required active effort rather than passive acceptance. According to the narrative, members of Camilla's circle allegedly viewed these developments with mixed emotions. Some reportedly saw no connection between William's efforts and Camilla's family. Others allegedly worried that growing attention to Diana's legacy would inevitably invite comparisons. Comparisons between Diana and Camilla, comparisons between their children, and comparisons between the futures each family had secured. Supporters of the story argue that these comparisons became increasingly difficult to avoid because the public remained deeply invested in Diana's memory decades after her death. According to many royal commentators, the deeper issue was never really about property at all. It was about identity. Camilla's children reportedly inherited certainty regarding their family history. William inherited responsibility for a legacy that belonged not only to his family but to millions of people around the world. Supporters of the narrative claim that this distinction ultimately shaped every decision he made moving forward. According to the story, by the end of this period, William had allegedly reached an important conclusion. If Althorp could never become his, then Diana's legacy would have to become something even larger than Althorp, something permanent, something protected, and something capable of surviving long after individual properties, titles, and inheritance arrangements had passed into history. Supporters of the narrative claim that this realization would soon inspire William's most ambitious effort yet to secure his mother's memory, a move that would transform the debate entirely and ensure that Diana's influence remained impossible to ignore for generations to come. According to supporters of the narrative, the final chapter allegedly began when Prince William stopped asking what he could inherit and started asking what he could preserve, because after years of quietly accepting that Althorp would never belong to him, despite being the place most closely associated with his mother's life and final resting place, he reportedly reached a conclusion that would ultimately redefine his entire approach to Diana's legacy. Ownership, supporters of a story claim, was no longer the objective. Control was no longer the objective. Instead, William allegedly became focused on something far more important, ensuring that Princess Diana's influence, values, and historical significance would remain protected long after questions of inheritance had faded into history. According to the narrative, this shift in perspective transformed William's thinking completely. Rather than concentrating on property, rather than dwelling on family inheritance rules, and rather than comparing his situation to that of Camilla's children, he allegedly began focusing on legacy itself, a legacy that extended far beyond any estate, far beyond any title, and far beyond any single location. According to supporters of the story, William reportedly became convinced that the most effective way to honor Diana was not by attempting to acquire places connected to her life, but by strengthening the institutions, charitable initiatives, and public projects associated with her memory. In this view, Althorp remained important, Diana's grave remained important, and the Spencer family's stewardship remained important. But none of those things alone could guarantee that future generations would fully understand Diana's impact on the monarchy, on humanitarian work, and on millions of people around the world. What allegedly followed was the beginning of a broader effort to secure Diana's place in history, not through ownership, but through preservation, not through inheritance, but through influence. And according to supporters of the narrative, William reportedly began supporting initiatives designed to ensure that Diana's story remained accessible, relevant, and protected for decades to come. According to many commentators following the narrative, this approach represented a significant personal victory because it allowed William to move beyond the limitations that had frustrated him for years. He could never inherit Althorp. He could never rewrite the Spencer family's inheritance traditions, and he could never alter the legal realities surrounding ownership of the estate. Yet supporters of the story argue that he discovered something far more powerful, the ability to shape how Diana would be remembered by future generations regardless of who controlled the property where she was buried. According to the narrative, this realization also changed the broader conversation surrounding Camilla's family. Because once William shifted his attention toward preservation, the comparison between inheritances began to matter less. Camilla's children could inherit homes, properties, and personal assets, but supporters of the story claim that William was now focused on something much larger: the protection of a global legacy. According to many observers, this distinction helps explain why discussions surrounding Diana continue attracting extraordinary attention nearly 3 decades after her death. Properties may change hands, titles may evolve, and family fortunes may rise or fall. Yet Diana's influence remains uniquely resilient. Supporters of the narrative argue that William increasingly recognized this reality and began treating her legacy not as something confined to Althorp, but as something that belonged to history itself. What makes the ending especially emotional is the role Althorp still plays in the story. Because despite everything, the estate remains deeply significant. It remains the place where Diana grew up, the place where countless memories were formed, and the place where she finally rests. According to supporters of the narrative, William's connection to that place never weakened. It simply evolved. According to the story, William ultimately came to understand that preserving Diana's legacy did not require ownership of Althorp. What mattered was ensuring that her values, her humanitarian work, her compassion, and her influence continued inspiring future generations. Supporters of the narrative claim that this realization allowed him to move beyond frustration and embrace a broader mission, one focused on memory rather than property, purpose rather than possession, and legacy rather than inheritance. In the end, supporters of the story argue that the real lesson has nothing to do with estates, wealth, or inheritance documents. It is about the difference between owning history and protecting it. It is about understanding that some legacies are too important to be measured in acres or financial value. And it is about recognizing that the most meaningful inheritance Diana left her sons was never land. It was responsibility. Responsibility to preserve what she stood for. Responsibility to protect her memory. And responsibility to ensure that her story continues to matter. According to supporters of the narrative, that is the mission William ultimately chose to embrace. Whether or not he ever controls the place most closely associated with Diana's life, he remains one of the most important guardians of her legacy. And in the eyes of many who follow the story, that responsibility may prove far more significant than ownership ever could. So what do you think? Is preserving a person's legacy more important than inheriting their property, or do places like Althorpe carry a unique importance that can never be replaced? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest coverage of Prince William, Diana, Princess of Wales, Queen Camilla, and the ongoing story surrounding the British royal family. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Have you ever wondered how the most significant shifts inside the British royal family often happen without a single public announcement, without a balcony appearance, and without most people even realizing that the balance of power has quietly changed? According to supporters of a growing royal narrative, that is exactly what happened when King Charles made a surprising decision involving Princess Anne's husband, Sir Timothy Lawrence, a man who has spent more than 3 decades avoiding attention, refusing privilege, and remaining almost entirely invisible to the public eye. Yet according to the story, one private ceremony, held far from London's cameras, allegedly sent a message so powerful that palace insiders immediately understood its significance. Because this was not simply about honoring a loyal family member. Supporters of the narrative claim it was about trust, influence, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. And according to many observers, the decision may have revealed more about King Charles's priorities than any public speech he has delivered since becoming king. According to supporters of the narrative, the story began at Balmoral, the royal family's historic Scottish retreat. Not Buckingham Palace, not Windsor Castle, and not during a major state occasion. Instead, the event reportedly took place in a private setting, away from public attention, away from television cameras, and away from the endless speculation that usually surrounds royal developments. According to the story, King Charles personally elevated Sir Timothy Lawrence to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed directly by the monarch. Supporters of the narrative claim that what made the moment extraordinary was not merely the honor itself, but the fact that Charles personally chose Timothy for recognition at a time when every royal decision was being scrutinized for clues about the monarchy's future. Unlike many awards that involve committees, government recommendations, or political considerations, this honor reportedly reflected the king's personal judgment. It was his decision alone, and according to many commentators, that fact made the gesture impossible to ignore. What makes Sir Timothy Lawrence such a fascinating figure in this story is the remarkable contrast between his position today and the way he has lived almost his entire adult life. For more than 30 years, he has remained in the background, rarely giving interviews, rarely attracting headlines, and almost never becoming the focus of royal discussion. According to supporters of the narrative, that was entirely intentional. According to the story, when Timothy married Princess, and in 1992, he reportedly had opportunities to embrace titles, privileges, and greater visibility within royal life. Yet supporters of the narrative claim that he consistently chose a different path. Rather than seeking attention, he allegedly preferred supporting Anne's work quietly. Rather than building a public profile, he reportedly concentrated on helping maintain stability behind the scenes. And rather than using his royal connections for personal advantage, supporters of the story argue that he spent decades demonstrating a level of discretion that became increasingly rare in an era dominated by media attention and public exposure. According to many royal observers, this approach earned Timothy a reputation unlike almost anyone else who married into the royal family. He was dependable, predictable, and trusted, not because he sought influence, but because he never appeared interested in pursuing it. Supporters of the narrative claim that over time this quiet consistency became one of his greatest strengths. especially within an institution that values loyalty above almost everything else. According to the story, Timothy's role extended far beyond that of a supportive spouse. Throughout the years, Princess and became known as one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, often completing more official engagements than any other royal. Supporters of the narrative argue that maintaining such a demanding schedule required extraordinary support behind the scenes, and many believe Timothy played a crucial role in helping make that possible. While and carried out public duties, he reportedly handled countless responsibilities that allowed her to focus on royal service without distraction. What allegedly impressed both Queen Elizabeth II and later King Charles was not a single act of service, not a dramatic sacrifice, and not a public display of loyalty. Instead, according to supporters of the story, it was the accumulation of decades of reliability, decades of discretion, and decades of placing duty ahead of personal recognition. According to many commentators following the narrative, this reputation became especially important during periods of instability within the royal family. Over the years, the monarchy faced scandals, controversies, public criticism, and internal tensions that frequently dominated headlines. Yet supporters of the story claim that Timothy remained largely untouched by such turmoil. He did not become a source of controversy. He did not create additional problems, and he reportedly maintained the same steady approach regardless of what challenges the institution happened to be facing at any given moment. According to the narrative, this is precisely why Charles's decision carried such significance. Because honors within the royal family are rarely just about recognition. They are about symbolism, they are about priorities, and they are about identifying the people a monarch values most. Supporters of the story argue that by elevating Timothy at this particular moment, Charles was doing far more than rewarding past service. He was allegedly highlighting the qualities he believes the monarchy needs most as it navigates an uncertain future: loyalty, stability, discretion, and duty, qualities that Timothy has reportedly embodied for more than 3 decades. According to supporters of the narrative, however, the most fascinating aspect of the story was not the honor itself, but the message hidden behind it. Because as palace insiders allegedly began discussing the implications of Timothy's elevation, attention quickly shifted toward a much larger question. Why did King Charles choose this moment to make such a powerful statement? And according to the story, the answer may reveal an emerging power structure inside the royal family that could reshape relationships at the highest levels of the monarchy for years to come. According to supporters of the narrative, the true significance of King Charles's decision allegedly became clear only after royal observers began examining exactly what Sir Timothy Lawrence had received, because while many casual followers of the monarchy initially viewed the announcement as another routine royal honor, those familiar with the traditions, symbolism, and hierarchy of the Royal Victorian Order reportedly understood almost immediately that something far more important was taking place behind the scenes, and that the king's decision was likely intended to communicate a message that extended well beyond simple recognition for years of service. According to many commentators following the story, the award itself was not merely ceremonial. It was personal, it was deliberate, and perhaps most importantly, it reflected Charles's own judgment regarding which individuals had earned his deepest trust during one of the most challenging periods of his reign. According to the narrative, the honor bestowed upon Sir Timothy was the Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, often referred to simply as the GCVO, a distinction that occupies one of the highest levels within an order created specifically to recognize personal service to the monarch and the royal family. Unlike many honors awarded through political recommendation, governmental committees, or public nominations, supporters of the story emphasize that appointments within the Royal Victorian Order originate directly from the sovereign himself, making them among the most personal expressions of royal appreciation available within the British honor system. And according to royal observers, that distinction is precisely what transformed Timothy's elevation from an interesting ceremonial development into a powerful statement about influence, loyalty, and confidence inside the royal household. What reportedly made the decision especially noteworthy was the timing. King Charles had already been navigating enormous pressures, constitutional responsibilities, public scrutiny, health concerns, and ongoing debates regarding the future direction of the monarchy. According to supporters of the narrative, every significant decision carried added weight, because every decision was being examined for clues about the king's priorities. According to the story, Charles could have chosen countless opportunities to recognize Sir Timothy's decades of service, yet supporters of the narrative claim that the king deliberately selected this particular moment because it allowed him to highlight qualities that he reportedly believes are essential for the monarchy's long-term stability. Rather than celebrating celebrity, media attention, or public popularity, Charles allegedly chose to honor discretion, consistency, professionalism, and quiet dedication. Supporters of the story argue that the message was unmistakable. The people who matter most within the royal institution are often not the individuals generating headlines, but the individuals ensuring that the institution continues functioning effectively behind the scenes. According to many commentators, the location of the ceremony added another layer of symbolism to the event because it reportedly took place at Balmoral, a residence deeply associated with the late Queen Elizabeth II and one of the most private environments available to the royal family. Unlike grand ceremonies held at Buckingham Palace before large audiences and television cameras, Balmoral has traditionally served as a place where family relationships and personal trust often take precedence over public spectacle. Supporters of the narrative claim that Charles's decision to conduct the presentation there reinforced the idea that this was not primarily a public relations exercise but rather a deeply personal gesture directed toward someone he genuinely respected. What allegedly fascinated palace insiders was the fact that Sir Timothy himself appeared perfectly suited to receive an honor that emphasized personal service rather than public recognition. Throughout his royal life, he reportedly avoided self-promotion, avoided unnecessary attention, and avoided attempts to build a personal brand around his royal connections. According to supporters of the story, that restraint ultimately became one of his greatest strengths, because it distinguished him from many public figures who thrive on visibility. According to the narrative, Charles has reportedly become increasingly appreciative of individuals who contribute to the monarchy without seeking credit for their efforts, particularly at a time when public attention can often distort priorities and create incentives that conflict with the institution's long-term interests. Supporters of the story argue that Timothy's decades-long commitment to supporting Princess, and without ever becoming the center of attention, made him an ideal example of the kind of service Charles wishes to encourage throughout the royal household. According to many royal observers, the implications extended beyond Timothy himself because the honor also appeared to reflect Charles's growing reliance on a smaller group of trusted working royals. As the monarchy adapts to changing public expectations, financial pressures, and a more streamlined operational structure, supporters of the narrative claim that loyalty and dependability have become increasingly valuable commodities. In such an environment, individuals who consistently perform their duties without creating distractions naturally rise in importance, regardless of whether they occupy prominent positions in the public spotlight. The deeper commentators looked into the decision, the more significant it appeared, because the honor was not simply about the past. It was also about the future. It was not merely a reward. It was a signal. And according to supporters of the narrative, the signal was directed toward everyone paying close attention to the monarchy's internal dynamics. According to the story, the elevation of Sir Timothy Lawrence allegedly revealed the qualities King Charles values most as he continues shaping the future of the institution: steadiness over spectacle, reliability over publicity, and commitment over personal ambition. Supporters of the narrative argue that once those implications became clear, attention quickly shifted away from the honor itself and toward a larger question that many palace insiders were reportedly asking. If Charles was publicly demonstrating such extraordinary confidence in Princess and his husband, what did that suggest about his own growing influence within the royal structure? And according to the story, the answer would reveal an emerging power dynamic capable of reshaping perceptions of who truly holds influence behind palace walls. According to supporters of the narrative, the reason King Charles's decision allegedly carried so much weight had very little to do with titles and honors themselves, and almost everything to do with the extraordinary journey that brought Sir Timothy Lawrence to this moment, because unlike many individuals who enter royal life through fame, influence, political connections, or public attention, Timothy reportedly built his reputation through something far less visible yet far more valuable. Within the royal household, decades of consistent service unwavering discretion, and a remarkable ability to support the institution without ever attempting to place himself at the center of it. And according to many royal observers, it was precisely this history that made Charles's recognition feel less like a ceremonial reward and more like the culmination of a relationship built upon trust earned over more than 3 decades. According to the narrative, Timothy's connection to public service began long before his marriage to Princess, and because prior to becoming a member of the royal family, he established a respected career within the Royal Navy, serving in positions that required discipline, professionalism, and an understanding of responsibility under pressure. Supporters of the story claim that these experiences shaped many of the qualities that would later define his role within royal life, particularly his preference for duty over publicity and his tendency to focus on results rather than recognition. Unlike figures drawn toward public attention, Timothy reportedly developed a mindset that prioritized service itself, a characteristic that would eventually distinguish him from almost everyone around him. What allegedly impressed members of the royal family from the beginning was not a dramatic gesture, not a public campaign, and not an effort to win approval. Instead, according to supporters of the narrative, it was his reliability, his professionalism, and his willingness to operate quietly regardless of circumstances. According to the story, after marrying Princess, and in 1992, Timothy entered one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world, yet he reportedly managed something that many others found extraordinarily difficult. He became part of the royal system without becoming consumed by it. Supporters of the narrative claim that while public attention often focused on more prominent royals, Timothy consistently remained in the background, supporting Anne's work, fulfilling necessary responsibilities, and avoiding the controversies that repeatedly generated headlines elsewhere within the family. Over time, this consistency allegedly became one of his defining characteristics, and one of the primary reasons he earned such deep respect behind palace walls. According to many commentators following the narrative, Queen Elizabeth II reportedly developed considerable trust in Timothy because she valued individuals who understood the importance of stability within an institution built upon continuity and tradition. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth witnessed countless political changes, social transformations, and family challenges, yet supporters of the story argue that she consistently appreciated people who could be relied upon regardless of circumstances. Timothy allegedly fit that description perfectly. He did not seek headlines. He did not create unnecessary distractions, and he reportedly approached royal life with the same disciplined mindset that had guided his earlier naval career. The longer he remained within the royal household, the stronger that reputation reportedly became. Year after year, engagement after engagement, and challenge after challenge. According to supporters of the narrative, Timothy demonstrated a level of consistency that became increasingly rare in modern public life. According to the story, this reputation eventually extended beyond Queen Elizabeth and into the reign of King Charles, who allegedly came to appreciate many of the same qualities. As Charles navigated the transition from heir to monarch, managed growing constitutional responsibilities, and faced the challenges associated with leading a modern monarchy, supporters of the narrative claim that dependable individuals became more valuable than ever. In such an environment, Timothy's decades-long record of loyalty reportedly stood out as a powerful example of the kind of service Charles believed the institution needed most. What reportedly makes Timothy's story especially remarkable is that his influence was allegedly built without any obvious pursuit of influence at all. He rarely spoke publicly, rarely promoted himself, and rarely attempted to shape public narratives. Yet according to supporters of the story, his credibility continued growing precisely because he avoided those things. According to many royal observers, this dynamic helps explain why his elevation attracted so much attention among palace insiders. The honor was not being awarded to someone who had spent years seeking recognition. It was being awarded to someone who reportedly spent years avoiding it. Supporters of the narrative argue that this distinction made the gesture uniquely powerful because it reinforced the idea that genuine service eventually earns respect even when it occurs far from public view. According to the narrative, Timothy's relationship with Princess Anne also played a significant role in strengthening his standing within the family because Anne herself has long been regarded as one of the hardest-working and most dependable members of the monarchy. Supporters of the story claim that maintaining such an extraordinary workload for decades required exceptional support behind the scenes, and many believe Timothy provided exactly that. While, and carried out hundreds of engagements each year, he reportedly helped create the stability that allowed her to focus so completely on public service. In this sense, supporters of the narrative argue that Charles's recognition honored not only Timothy's individual contributions, but also the partnership that has quietly supported one of the monarchy's most respected working royals. According to many commentators, the deeper significance of the honor becomes clear when viewed through the lens of trust. Institutions survive because people trust one another. Monarchies survive because certain individuals consistently place duty above personal ambition. And supporters of the story claim that Timothy's entire royal career has been defined by exactly those qualities. For more than 30 years, he reportedly demonstrated loyalty without demanding rewards, service without demanding recognition, and commitment without demanding influence. According to supporters of the narrative, that is why Charles's decision allegedly resonated so strongly throughout royal circles, because it suggested that the king was not merely honoring the past but identifying the people he believes will help secure the monarchy's future. And as observers began considering the implications of that message, attention increasingly shifted toward another important figure standing beside Timothy throughout those decades of service. Princess Anne herself, whose influence inside the royal institution appeared to be growing stronger than ever before. According to supporters of the narrative, the most intriguing consequence of King Charles's decision allegedly had very little to do with Sir Timothy Lawrence himself, and much more to do with what the honor appeared to reveal about the changing balance of influence inside the royal family, because while the public often focuses on kings, queens, princes, and headline-generating controversies, palace insiders reportedly pay far closer attention to the monarch's inner circle, the individuals, whose judgment is trusted, whose advice is valued, and whose presence becomes increasingly important during periods of uncertainty. And according to many commentators following the story, Charles's decision to elevate Princess Anne's husband was interpreted by some observers as evidence that Anne's branch of the family was quietly becoming one of the most influential forces within the modern monarchy. According to the narrative, Princess Anne has spent decades building a reputation unlike almost any other royal. She rarely seeks publicity, rarely participates in media campaigns, and rarely becomes the subject of dramatic headlines. Instead, supporters of the story claim that she has focused relentlessly on duty, year after year, engagement after engagement, and decade after decade. According to many royal observers, Anne's work ethic has become legendary within royal circles because she consistently carries out hundreds of official engagements every year while maintaining a level of discipline and professionalism that even critics often acknowledge. Supporters of the narrative argue that this reputation has only become more valuable as the monarchy navigates an era defined by intense media scrutiny, changing public expectations, and increasing pressure on a smaller group of working royals. In such an environment, reliability reportedly becomes one of the institution's most precious resources. What allegedly makes Charles's decision so significant is the fact that honoring Timothy indirectly highlights Anne's importance as well. Because Timothy's role has always been connected to Anne's work, her schedule, her responsibilities, and her contribution to the institution. According to supporters of the narrative, recognizing one inevitably draws attention to the other. According to the story, Charles has increasingly relied upon experienced working royals capable of carrying out responsibilities without creating distractions, and supporters of the narrative claim that Anne has emerged as one of the most trusted figures within that group. While younger royals continue developing their future roles and other members of the family attract periodic controversy, Anne reportedly remains a constant presence, offering continuity, experience, and stability at a time when those qualities are more important than ever. According to many commentators, this development allegedly carries broader implications because it reflects Charles's vision for a streamlined monarchy, one in which a relatively small number of dependable working royals shoulder the majority of public responsibilities. Supporters of the story argue that under such a model, influence is no longer determined solely by rank or public visibility. Instead, influence increasingly belongs to those individuals who consistently demonstrate competence, loyalty, and an ability to support the institution's long-term goals. And according to the narrative, and Timothy fit that description almost perfectly. The timing reportedly added even greater significance, because Charles was not making this decision during a period of calm. He was leading the monarchy through challenges, through uncertainty, and through intense public scrutiny. According to supporters of the story, every symbolic gesture mattered, every appointment mattered, and every honor carried a message. According to the narrative, some royal observers allegedly interpreted Timothy's elevation as a signal that Charles intends to reward quiet service rather than public prominence, emphasizing substance over visibility and commitment over celebrity. Supporters of the story claim that this message resonated strongly because it contrasted with the modern media environment, where attention often flows toward controversy rather than consistency. By recognizing Timothy, Charles reportedly highlighted the type of contribution he believes deserves greater appreciation within the institution. What allegedly fueled additional speculation was the inevitable comparison with other influential figures inside royal circles. Not because Charles publicly criticized anyone, not because he announced a major restructuring, and not because any formal conflict existed, but because observers naturally began asking who appeared to be moving closer to the center of royal decision-making. According to supporters of the narrative, Anne's position seemed stronger than ever. According to many commentators following the story, Queen Camilla remains one of the most important figures within the monarchy, yet Charles's decision reportedly reminded observers that influence inside royal institutions is often more complex than official titles suggest. Power can come from trust, it can come from experience, and it can come from decades of proven reliability. Supporters of the narrative argue that Anne and Timothy have spent years quietly accumulating exactly that kind of credibility, making them increasingly valuable as Charles shapes the future of the monarchy. According to the story, the honor therefore became symbolic of something much larger than individual recognition. It reflected Charles's confidence in a particular group of working royals. It highlighted the growing importance of duty-focused figures within the institution, and it reinforced the idea that those who serve consistently behind the scenes may ultimately wield more influence than many people realize. Supporters of the narrative claim that this realization explains why palace insiders reportedly paid such close attention to what appeared on the surface to be a relatively quiet ceremony. And according to supporters of the narrative, as observers continued examining the implications of Timothy's elevation, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. Charles was not merely rewarding the past. He was signaling something about the future, a future in which loyalty, experience, and dedication would play a central role in determining who shapes the monarchy's next chapter. And according to the story, that larger message would become even clearer when considering what this decision ultimately revealed about Charles's long-term vision for the royal family and the legacy he hopes to leave behind. According to supporters of the narrative, the true importance of King Charles's decision may not be fully understood for years, because while the elevation of Sir Timothy Lawrence appeared on the surface to be a simple act of recognition for decades of loyal service, many royal observers believe it actually reveals something much deeper about how Charles intends to guide the monarchy through one of the most challenging and uncertain periods in its modern history. At a time when the institution continues adapting to changing public expectations, reduced numbers of working royals, ongoing health concerns within the family, and constant media scrutiny, supporters of the story argue that Charles deliberately chose to highlight a set of values that he believes will determine whether the monarchy remains stable in the decades ahead. And according to those observers, the message could not have been clearer. Loyalty, discretion, consistency, and duty matter more than publicity, attention, and personal ambition. According to the narrative, Sir Timothy Lawrence became the perfect symbol of that message because his entire royal journey allegedly stands in direct contrast to the celebrity culture that increasingly surrounds public life. He did not build influence through interviews. He did not build influence through headlines. And he did not build influence through carefully crafted public campaigns. Instead, supporters of the story claim that he built influence through trust, through reliability, and through more than 3 decades of quiet service that rarely attracted public attention. According to many commentators following the narrative, that distinction may explain why Charles personally chose this moment to elevate Timothy to one of the highest levels of royal recognition. The king reportedly understood that institutions survive not because of the people generating the most publicity, but because of the people ensuring that responsibilities are fulfilled every single day regardless of circumstances. Supporters of the narrative argue that Timothy represents exactly that type of individual, someone whose value became increasingly apparent the longer he remained in service to the crown. What allegedly makes the story even more significant is the broader signal it sends about the future structure of the royal family. Because the honor was not merely about Timothy, it was also about Princess Anne, about the working royals, and about the people Charles appears to trust most. According to supporters of the narrative, the ceremony effectively highlighted an entire group of individuals who have spent years supporting the institution without demanding recognition in return. According to the story, the modern monarchy operates with a smaller group of active working royals than it once did, meaning that dependable figures such as Anne, Sir Timothy, Prince Edward, and Sophie increasingly play critical roles in maintaining stability. Supporters of the narrative claim that Charles recognizes this reality and has gradually begun rewarding those who consistently demonstrate commitment to the institution's long-term success. Rather than focusing attention exclusively on the most visible figures, he appears determined to acknowledge the individuals whose contributions often occur behind the scenes. According to many royal observers, this approach reflects lessons Charles learned during decades spent watching Queen Elizabeth II manage the monarchy. The late queen valued duty, she valued loyalty, and she valued people who understood that service was more important than personal recognition. Supporters of the story argue that Timothy embodies many of those same principles, which may explain why both Elizabeth and Charles reportedly came to view him as one of the most dependable figures within the royal household. What reportedly makes this especially meaningful is the fact that Timothy never appeared to seek such recognition. For more than 30 years, he remained in the background, supporting the institution, and avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. According to supporters of the narrative, that is precisely why the honor carries so much weight, because it demonstrates that genuine service is eventually noticed even when it occurs far from public view. According to the story, the ceremony at Balmoral may ultimately be remembered as more than a personal milestone for Sir Timothy Lawrence. It may be remembered as a statement about the kind of monarchy Charles wants to build. A monarchy that values substance over spectacle. A monarchy that rewards commitment over popularity. And a monarchy that places trust in people who consistently demonstrate their dedication through actions rather than words. Supporters of the narrative claim that this philosophy could shape royal decision-making for years to come as Charles continues defining his reign. And perhaps